Thank you. Thank you very much, Bruno. This is an honor. I'm just going to share my screen and then. Okay. So I'm going to play a dish for you, a liturgical song that we will talk about throughout the talk. But I have a recording for you made by Zülfü Livaneli, for those of you who know, that will not be exactly the same as this, taken from an early 20th century anthology, but the differences between the wording of the song and of the written version will be something that will be part of the theme of our talk. So I just wanted to start, since we're going to be talking about orality, I wanted to start with an oral poem for you. So here it goes.
Sorarsan Ali'dir Ali, altından çakılmış düldülün nalı. Kim sürdü kuyuda kırk karşın yolu, bu yolun erkanın bilenler gelsin, bu yolun erkanın bilenler gelsin. Sultan
I think you were able to hear a quatrain. Weren't you not? You heard a quatrain. Okay, good. Oh God. Okay. I hope this does not happen again. I apologize to everyone. Anyway, but I think you got the point of it. So I want to bring in my presentation, and if you do want to, I will send you the link after the talk to the entire song. So if you want to listen to it on your own time, you can do that. And this will be, of course, I see many familiar names in the audience. So thank you very much for those of you I know who have come here to join to join us. And I want to today, I will sort of begin by historicizing Alevism, for those of you who don't know, and then getting little by little into the oral and mostly manuscript sources. In modern Turkey, Alevism serves as both a religious denomination and a social identity for approximately 10 to 30% of the population. Since the early 20th century, the term Alevi has emerged as an umbrella label encompassing various social and religious communities, historically known as Kızılbaş, a pre-modern term derived from the red headgear worn by Turkmen supporters of the Safavid dynasty, which was later abandoned due to its pejorative connotations. These communities predominantly inhabit Anatolia, Thrace, and to a lesser extent, Bulgaria and Albania. While Alevism incorporates elements of Shi'i thought and piety, it is crucial to recognize its distinction from Twelver Shi'ism. This differentiation stems from Alevism's unique origins, modes of emergence, and the diversity of its beliefs and practices. A significant body of works, collectively referred to as Alevi Bektashi literature, serves as a valuable historical resource for understanding Alevi piety. This corpus includes texts produced by wandering dervishes, which illuminate the development of vernacular religious traditions across Anatolia and the Balkans, where the textual production of the urban elite remains our main source. Among the prominent groups of wandering dervishes in late medieval Anatolia were the Abdals and the Bektashis, both of which coalesced into the Ottoman Bektashi Sufi order from the 16th century onwards. After the abolition of the Bektashi order in modern Turkey in 1925, due to the ban on Sufi orders, its center shifted to Albania, where Bektashis now comprise about 20% of the Muslim population. The order is often referred to as the Babagan branch of Bektashism, while followers of Hacı Bektaş's family, known as Çelebis, form a distinct group still active in contemporary Turkey. Historically, the Bektashi order has maintained close doctrinal and practical ties with the Alevis. Dervish piety has been instrumental in shaping Alevi beliefs and practices. I'm not going to be able to get into all the details of this, but the official foundation of the Bektashi order in 1501 marked the confluence of mystical traditions from the early Bektashis, the Abdals of Rum, and various other dervish groups, as well as those of the Ahis and the Hurufis. The Islamic chivalric tradition of Futuwa, also known as Ahilik, was widespread in late medieval Anatolia. It is at the origin of a number of Bektashi and Kızılbaş texts and documents. The esoteric movement known as Hurufism, originating with Fadlullah Esterabadi and his disciple Nesimi in the 14th century, was integrated into Bektashism and Alevism from the 15th century onward. The pre-modern Alevi Bektashi corpus, spanning from the 14th to the early 20th century, consists of works produced by the Kızılbaş, Bektashis, and the Abdals of Rum, as well as the other groups that I just mentioned. A significant portion of this corpus comprises mystical poetry, known as nefes or değiş that you just heard, which often takes the form of quatrains in syllabic meter and is sung during the gem ceremony, the central rite of both Alevism and Bektashism. While the nefes or değiş are circulated orally, they are also preserved in mecmuas, miscellanies, and cönks. According to modern Turkish terminology, whereas mecmuas are horizontal, the cönk are vertical. Of course, the word cönk comes from Persian, but it is initially derived from a Javanese or Malaysian term for a long-ruddered sailboat. Cönks are literary anthologies that acquired their name due to their compact size and slender form, which facilitated easier and more economical production and transport. The practice of cönk writing goes back to the mid-millennium, paralleling the expansion of print culture in Europe. According to Ali Kara Mustafa, the emergence of singer-poet aşık traditions in the 16th century is related to these changes in patterns of literacy. We're going to be talking a lot about literacy today. The Kızılbaş singer poets were also a type of aşık. However, the relationship of the Kızılbaş poet milieu with the broader single poet traditions remains to be investigated. Like aşık poetry, many of the anthologies with Alevi Bektashi content primarily serve as poetry collections, the mass majority of which have not been studied or edited. These collections have been compiled by selections from other manuscripts, as well as by writing down poems heard at performances. A second important part of the Alevi Bektashi manuscript corpus comprises the numerous Alevi sacred texts known as buyruks. The word buyruk, which does not appear in the manuscripts, is used in two different ways. The first is the general name given to works in which the pillars of Alevism, as well as certain Sufi teachings, are conveyed through Quranic quotations and numerous stories about Muhammad and Ali ibn Abi Talib. These texts, which form two distinct branches, are said to date back to Sefiyuddin Erdebili, the founder of the Safavid order, or to Imam Jafar al-Sadiq. In its second use, the word buyruk refers to the Alevi religious mecmua, containing these and various other texts. Nefes and değiş also appear in buyruk manuscripts between and after prose units. The works of Turkish-speaking dervish groups, which make up the oldest part of this corpus, produced from the 14th century onwards, belong to many genres, such as mesnevis, treatises, poetry collections, erkam-names, that is, texts expounding the pillars of the way, epic works, hagiographies, and prose works of fiction. Many of these texts circulated widely outside of the Bektashi and Alevi communities. Their importance for the religious history of Anatolia and the Balkans goes beyond the Alevi Bektashi context, in addition to their role in the vernacularization of Ottoman Turkish as a literary language. The variety of genres in this corpus, because of its role in diversifying content and audience, can be seen as an important contribution to the heterogeneity of the Alevi Bektashi doctrinal field. The emergence of Alevi studies as a field is now an important turning point that is happening right now, that has only recently come to public attention. New academic posts and undergraduate programs, such as those set up at the University of Vienna, Alevi learning spaces called Alevi Akademisi that bring together academics with the Dede, Alevi religious leaders, popular writers and practitioners. The recently created Alevi Studies Network, which not only enables communication but also organizes conferences, are all fascinating developments. Today, I want to discuss the methodology required by this new field in its engagement with manuscript sources. I will seek to classify the pre-modern literary corpus of Alevism and Bektashism that has come down to us in manuscript form, according to the text's various forms of engagement with oral tradition. By investigating the relationship between oral and written traditions as they relate to Alevi and Bektashi literature, I will attempt to highlight the unique multidisciplinary quality of academic research in this nascent field. The convergence of oral and written tradition in the study of Alevi sources appears to be a hallmark of the field of Alevi studies. From the 14th century onwards, for the whole of the Ottoman period up to the middle of the 20th century, the textual corpus available to us is only a small trace of an oral tradition. What we're trying to do is to bring these traces together to imagine a whole. This raises the question of audience. Who are these texts intended for? How are they meant to be read? How do the interpretive strategies required of the reader or listener differ from those of participants in another discursive tradition? For example, how do the nefes and deish differ from Sufi poems, other Sufi poems, in their interpretive and experiential dimensions? If the interpretive strategies required to experience them are not significantly different, or on the contrary, very different from those of Sufi ilahi poems, due to their similarities and differences in oral context, starting with the fact that the Bektashis were Sufis, what does this tell us about the boundaries of traditions? Establishing interpretive strategies tells us about interpretive communities, which can enable us to talk about the boundaries between different traditions. From this perspective, a correct understanding of the literature in question would involve interpreting texts as they would be read by the interpretive communities that produce them. This, of course, is an ideal, but that's where we should guide ourselves towards. This requires a historiographical approach that highlights the social context in which the texts circulate. Modern nationalist discourse on Alevi Bektashi literature, and even more so on Ottoman literature in general, has led to ahistorical interpretive strategies, which read nationalist ideology into the meanings of texts as well as into their production in Turkish, as opposed to Arabic or Persian. The notion of interpretive communities offers us a way of overcoming the ideological viewpoints that feed on the gap between historiography and literary studies. To speak of the interpretive strategies that the Alevi Bektashi corpus demands of its reader, we must perhaps begin with the word reader. The essentially oral nature of the Alevi milieu, where religious transmission is largely by oral and mimetic means, has been emphasized by various scholars. We know very little about how texts were consumed in this milieu. The few studies we have on the role of texts in the Alevi village context are anthropological studies from the modern era, which emphasize that the dede, the spiritual leaders of the community, and their families were generally the few people who were literate. Texts served largely to educate and inspire them, giving them the role of mediators between the text and the community. Some poet-musicians, Aşık or Zakir, could also read and write. We can characterize this milieu by Jack Goody's term restricted literacy, which emphasizes that, quote, we must recognize an important class of society in which the implications of literacy are only partially developed, a class in which oral tradition continues to play a dominant role in spheres that are potentially literary, unquote. We might add that Ottoman society as a whole can be regarded as a society of limited literacy. The nature and extent of this restricted literacy can vary considerably from one context to another. Indeed, from the early stages of the Islamization of Anatolia and the Balkans, Sufi lodges served as an interface between the literate Islamic institutions of the cities and the Turkmen communities of the countryside. We could add Kurdish communities and other ethnic communities as well to this, some of which are the precursors of the Alevis. Because of their greater integration into Sufi networks and their presence in urban environments, we can assume that the nature of literacy in Bektashi convents were different from the level of literacy of their Alevi followers. This helps explain why the majority of texts in the Alevi Bektashi corpus are of Bektashi origin. However, within Bektashism itself, relations to literacy do not have a uniform character either. They depend on the location of lodges, their history, and the individual pedigree of their residents. All this should lead us to consider the existence of a multiplicity of interconnected interpretive communities whose relationships to literacy vary. This multiplicity is reinforced by the absence of a centralized Alevi institution charged with imposing orthodoxy, which translates into local differences in traditions. All this poses a number of methodological problems. Firstly, as I've already pointed out, the literary sources that have come down to us in written form are often Bektashi texts. This picture may change somewhat with the results of the Alevi Bektashi Digital Archive project, where I can see Özkan Karabulut here, who is working in this project. This is a new manuscript database project led by Ayfer Karakaya from the College of William and Mary in the USA, where project members visit Alevi villages and digitize the manuscripts in the hands of villagers. Yet with the current state of affairs, it has to be admitted that the literature that has come down to us in written form is one that belongs to the most literate group in the Alevi Bektashi tradition. It is a kind of high culture within the tradition. This situation begins to change at the end of the 18th century, when the cönk and the mecmuas become widespread. As I'll explain later, the rise of the miscellanies in the 19th century was an important turning point in this respect. But the problem remains. Most of the literary corpus that has come down to us was transmitted through Bektashi lodges or Abdal lodges. This is also the case for certain manuscripts preserved by the Dede families. We must always ask ourselves to what extent and in what way this literature represented the Kızılbaş communities. And this was something actually that I just listened to Ayfer Karakaya talk about the project very recently, and she was also talking about this, and they're actually these Alevi communities being embedded in intertextual networks, so being part of an intertextual tradition. But how much of the manuscripts that are in their hands were actually produced in the local milieu is another topic of research that is, of course, that is vital for us to answer many of these questions. The relationship with writing poses another problem. We know, for example, that the buyruk, the sacred text of Alevism, did not circulate from hand to hand. Rather, the buyruk manuscript was a sacred object that was often guarded from the access of followers. A valuable example of the oral performance of written text is the genre of maktar, texts that recount the events of Kerbela. For example, the maktar produced by Yusuf Meddah in the 14th century adheres to past examples of Arabic literature in its division into 10 sections to be recited during the 10 days of Muharrem. Similarly, many texts in the Alevi Bektashi written corpus were composed to be performed orally, even when they were initially composed in written form. We must therefore consider the written and the oral as a spectrum, not as rigid exclusionary categories. In the light of this discussion, in the manuscript traditions of Alevism and Bektashism, we can speak of three types of texts in their relationship to orality. The first comprises texts produced by a single author that can be performed orally. The second group contains texts that have been collected from oral narratives. The third group is made up of poems composed orally or in writing, but later collected in cönks and mecmuas. So the first category, these are texts whose author has written down or dictated his text to a scribe. In my article titled Historicizing Alevism, the Evolution of Abdal and Bektashi Doctrine, I examined the works of 6 Abdals of Rum, members of the so-called Dervish movement, and tried to describe the historical evolution of Alevi doctrine through these texts. This corpus, dating from the end of the 14th century to the 17th century, included the works of Kaygusuz Abdal, Sadık Abdal's Divan, Yemini's Faziletname, Şemsi's Dehmuk, Virani's Risale and Divan, and Muhittin Abdal's Divan. Each of these texts belong to a single author and has manuscripts that have come down to us. Now imagine that these texts are interpreted, that the poetry found in the Divan is sung during the Cem ceremonies. Although these texts were produced in written form, they're open to transformation in their oral life. In this respect, they demonstrate the role of manuscript culture as a bridge between oral and print tradition. Indeed, the text written down in a manuscript does have an original, but this original becomes the source of an entire oral life. The interpreter who transforms the text in the course of a performance, according to the needs of the moment, doesn't feel that he's damaging the text, that he's being disloyal. On the contrary, by making the text contemporary to his audience, he puts it in a form that allows for the greatest aesthetic pleasure and religious feeling of his audience. From the interpreter's point of view, this is the precise definition of loyalty. In our classification of the text's relationship to orality, the second group consists of stories that circulate orally for a long time and are subsequently written down. Take, for example, the hagiography of Hacı Bektaş, eponym of the Bektashi order. Like many other hagiographies, it was written 2 centuries after the time of Hacı Bektaş, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. This means that the episodes it contains circulated orally for a long time before being written down. There are, of course, contrary examples, such as the hagiography of Osman Baba, who died in 1478, leader of the Abdals of Rum, written 5 years after his death by his successor Küçük Abdal. But even in this second example, it was only after Osman Baba had lived a long time, traveled, performed miracles, met Mehmet II, that these events, recounted from person to person, were retained and put in writing. I'm focusing here on the first example, texts that lived orally for centuries before being written down. The book entitled Bektaşi'nin Doğuşu, The Birth of Bektashism by Rıza Yıldırım, contains a section comparing the 2 versions of the same episode, that of Hacı Bektaş's arrival in Rome, in the hagiographies of Hacı Bektaş and the holy warrior Sarı Saltuk, who lived in the 13th century, so the Velayetname and the Saltukname. In this section, Yıldırım shows that both stories derive from the same oral narrative and that although they were collected at the same time, the Saltukname variant has undergone fewer changes. This is a valuable example of how the same stories can be written down in different places and at different times. However, it is not always possible to assert that the older variant is truer. In the example of Yıldırım, the Saltukname variant is closer to the historical version of events, but this can be explained by the way the 2 works were collected, by their collectors, and by their intended audiences. Our usual assumption that the older story is truer is due to an idea of the original that has its roots in written culture. Indeed, in the oral tradition, it's not possible to say that any one of the many stories that circulate is more original than the other. The idea of an original has a certain meaning for texts in the first group, those with authors, which is why it is possible to apply the philological method of critical edition to these texts. This method has been called into question in recent years as new approaches have come to the fore, emphasizing the importance of the manuscript as an object and the uniqueness of each manuscript. Nevertheless, the method remains relevant for the texts in our first group. Things get more complicated when the same author continues to revise his work after composing it. In this case, the aim is no longer to obtain a correct restitution, but to follow the traces of the author's pen, to observe his transformations. Sometimes these transformations result from the intervention of later copyists, in which case they also become an object of study. Texts derived from the collection of orally circulated narratives present a markedly different dynamic. A famous example is the various manuscripts of the Book of Dede Korkut, a collection of Turkmen epics, which were written down at different times. It is often not possible to apply the method of critical edition to these texts, as the different manuscripts of the text are not copied from one another. What we have at hand are various writings collected from oral tradition. The existence of the same episode in the Saltukname and the Velayetname can also be seen in the same light. One is not more original than the other. These texts have collectors, but they're also anonymous. So they do have collectors, we just don't know their name, much like a lot of folk poetry that I will come to. All this demonstrates the importance of understanding the logic of oral narration. The idea that change corrupts, that the oral is ephemeral and will therefore be lost, is a modern idea belonging to written culture. If there is no notion or practice of writing, it means that there is no way to understand that a poem has changed. It's not possible to record 2 versions of the same folk song, put them side by side, and ask which is the correct one. From this point of view, it is clear that the 19th century recording of the Değiş in the cönk and mecmuas, when most Alevi poetry was put down in writing for the first time, was an important turning point. This was the moment when the Kızılbaş tradition became a written tradition with all of its textual genres. In fact, poetry and folk stories of Aşık single poet traditions, as well as genres of old oral poetry, such as the Mani, were also put down in writing as a result of the 19th and early 20th century proliferation of miscellanea writing, marking this period as an inaugural moment that was radically transformative in terms of literary practices. Yes, yet this did not bring about a change in the conceptualization of authority in the way that the proliferation of print did, or in the radical transformation of authority that came with in the late 20th century in the Alevi milieu. Let's imagine the 19th century context in which one person has written down a deyş in a certain way in his personal notebook and another has written it down differently. They will determine the correctness of each version based on the context in which it was heard. Authority will thus remain once again in oral tradition because the accuracy of the written text will be determined by the authority of the person who constitutes its oral source. The written word has its own authority. The mere fact of being written confers authority on the text. In the oral tradition, on the other hand, authority belongs to the speaker. The truth of a word is not judged according to how closely it matches an original pronounced a few hundred years ago, but according to the spiritual level of the person speaking it. Of course, the person speaking it in our context, it would be the aşık would be speaking the word of God. He would be a Quran anatic, a speaking Quran. Another subject that I don't have time to get into, but maybe we can talk about it in the Q&A. After individual works and collected narratives, the third group of texts belonging to the pre-modern written tradition consists of poetry written down in miscellanies, mecmuas and cönks, that I have talked about. Within this group, a distinction must be made between poets whose written poems entered the miscellanies over time and those whose poetry was not written down outside of miscellanea. For example, the famous bard Pir Sultan that we were trying to listen to, who lived in the 16th century, never wrote down his poems, never formed a collected divan, but only performed his poems orally. We can contrast this with a figure like Virani, who lived in the late 16th, early 17th century, whose written divan has come down to us in manuscript form. Both poets, by the way, belong to the group currently known as Yedi Ulu Ozanlar, 7 great poets of Alevism. Pir Sultan and Virani both have individual poems, but the methods required to study them are completely different. I can study Virani's divan, I can try to get closer to an original through a critical edition, but I can't apply the critical edition method to Pir Sultan because I don't have a collection of written poems that comes from him. There are some 20th century collections that were made, by later people who studied, actually, the earliest folklorists who did some collections. If so, how do I know what Pir Sultan said? To answer this question, I have 2 types of sources. One is oral tradition, that is the deyş that are still sung today. As a folklorist or an ethnomusicologist, I can collect the deyş attributed to Pir Sultan in a particular region or collect the same deyş in different regions. There may be differences between the 2 different collections from the same region. Of these, it would not be possible to say that any one is more correct than the other, that it is closer to what the historical character of Pir Sultan sang. However, if this poet had been Virani, I could have consulted his 17th century text and questioned the closeness of the oral performances to his written text. The second type of source is the cönks and mecmuas, which became widespread in the 19th century. These miscellanies, as they appear in the 19th and early 20th centuries, can be also defined as simply as personal notebooks. I will show you an example at the end. The collector hears a poem at a gathering, a cafe, a group event of some kind, and writes it down in his notebook immediately or on his way home. I should note, of course, that this is a highly gendered practice. A woman would not only have been excluded from some of these spaces, but would also have rarely had access to literacy. We note that the poems of women bards were rarely written down in these notebooks. Their poetry was simply not recorded. And of course, the most striking example of this is the poetry of Güzide Ana, who is buried in the Hacı Bektaş Lodge, but who is still sung in liturgy, but none of her poems have come down to us through manuscripts. A closer look at this vast corpus demonstrates the problematic nature of the current academic divide between popular and classical literature in the field of Turkish literature. In these manuscripts, the poetry of Muhibbi, the Süleyman the Magnificent, rubs shoulders with that of the nomadic bard Karacaoğlan. These miscellanies include sultan poets, all types of court poets, urban bards such as Gevheri and Aşık Ömer, Sufi poets, Alevi Bektashi bards, and nomadic bards. Having studied the contents of a few hundred of these poetry miscellanies, I haven't seen a single one that contains only Alevi deyş. Further study of manuscripts from Alevi villages might yield different results. However, these collections of poetry that also include Alevi deyş clearly demonstrate that Alevi and Bektashi poetry was consumed and performed outside of these groups, that the Alevis and Bektashis were very familiar with other poetic genres and traditions. It seems obvious, but it has not really been at the core of historical understandings of Alevism or historiography, 20th century historiography. These manuscripts are one of the places where the closed society thesis, the idea that the Alevis the Kızılbaş lived in the mountains without contact with mainstream society, fails. This is, of course, in line with Judith Hogg's recent edition of 17th century Ottoman palace musician Ali Ufki's musical notation compilations, which clearly demonstrates that the deyş of Pir Sultan were sung in 17th century Istanbul. A quick glance at the contents of a miscellany in the catalog can tell us what type of miscellany it is. Sometimes miscellanies give the impression of a collection of Sufi religious poetry, in which Bektashi poets are present but do not constitute the majority. For example, a poetry collection without Yunus Emre, the founder of Turkish Sufi poetry, is rare. On the other hand, there are miscellanies whose content immediately indicates that they are of Bektashi origin. The Bektashi mecmuas, as it has come to be known, is the most common subtype of these poetry collections. For this reason, it has become a generic name, although we rarely hear terms such as Halveti mecmuası or Mevlevi mecmuası. Well, we do, but not as much. These terms, of course, can be used for collections produced by the members of these orders, or those that contain mainly Mevlevi poets and authors, but they have not been transformed in the same way into generic names. In fact, the Bektashi mecmuası are so widespread that to this day, poetry miscellanies are called Bektashi mecmuası, even though Bektashi poets are sometimes rare in them. I think the reason for this is, well, first of the confluence of the area of folklore with Alevi Bektashi literature that we might talk about in the Q&A. But another reason is that this type of manuscript was an object of collective consumption for the Bektashis, the Kızılbaş, and all the groups designated by the modern generic term of Alevism, due to the central role of poetry in Alevi Bektashi liturgy. The way in which this poetry was transported from one region to another by Bektashi and Alevi bards, the forms it took in different regions, the poems that were most often written in certain regions, etc., are all fascinating subjects of research. Although rare, some miscellanies contain colophons indicating the name of the collector, his Sufi affiliations, and the location of the collection. This is the case of the mecmua collected by Aşık Penahi in the early 20th century, which also includes one of his own poems. In his recent study of the manuscript, Ömercan Çetinkaya set out to investigate the reading practices of a Bektashi singer-poet, who actually also comes from the lineage of Somuncu Baba. So, he's he's in the middle of a network of several orders, I must say. The 19th century was, as I said, the period when an entire corpus of Alevi poetry, hitherto strictly oral, took on written form. A closer look at this process of transformation seems indispensable. By collecting all these miscellanies, reading the colophon where one may be found, and classifying the contents, we could obtain significant information on the circulation and variety of the deyş, as well as on the popularity of poets according to region. We could establish how the same poem was recited in different regions, compare these versions with contemporary versions of the poems, and study the changes that they have undergone to the present day. However, we cannot assume that the 19th century version of a poem indicates how Pir Sultan recited it. We can't say that one of the two 19th century versions that have come down from him is more correct than the other. For poetry that has been produced orally and lived orally for centuries, we must abandon all notions of correctness, originality, and copyright. We must say that what really matters for these deish is whether they resemble a deish by Pir Sultan, whether they faithfully reflect Pir Sultan's tradition or not. This means that Pir Sultan's corpus is no longer the product of an individual, but a tradition in which many other singer poets have participated. This is not the case with Yunus Emre, the most frequently cited example of a Yunus tradition. Like Virani, Yunus also had a divan, and his manuscripts have survived since the 15th century. But at the same time, his poetry has continued to live on orally, and many other poets have composed poems under the name of Yunus. Over time, in the manuscripts, Yunus's own poems were mixed with poems from the Yunus tradition, resulting in an exponential growth of this corpus. Yet if we were to carry out a comparative study of the earliest manuscripts today and prepare a critical edition, we could reach a poetic corpus that predates much of the proliferation, that is much closer to what Yunus himself composed. And I actually currently, nobody's doing, it's sort of unbelievable that this hasn't been done yet, but there is currently a critical edition being done of the Risalet-ü Nusiyye, which is his Mesnevi, which was part of the Divan. This is not possible to do in the case of Pir Sultan. It will never be possible to differentiate Pir Sultan's own poems from the poems of those that later adopted his name. More importantly, such a problem makes no sense from our perspective. Well, we need to ask ourselves different questions. What are the aesthetics of this poetry? What vision of the world does it convey? What kind of language and what elements of piety does it display? All these questions can still have responses when we consider Pir Sultan as a living tradition spanning several centuries. So to conclude, I have addressed three distinct areas of the pre-modern Alevi Bektashi literary tradition that has come down to us in manuscript form. These include individual works, collections of oral narratives, and poems produced orally or in writing and subsequently recorded in miscellanies. I've tried to show that each of these groups of sources requires a different methodology. At the same time, we can say that they have many points in common. Indeed, all of these corpuses that result from different modes of production force us to consider oral and written traditions side by side and create new methodologies. When we transform the perspective inherited from classical philology and stop looking for what is true and correct, we will acquire the ability to examine together the 15 or so variants that have come down to us from Pir Sultan. If we return to our previous discussion, we see that as scholars, the study of oral tradition and of a written tradition nested within an oral tradition is not easy. On the contrary, it is a very difficult scholarly undertaking. From a methodological point of view, it can be more difficult to study a system of thought and belief in which oral tradition occupies central place. Yet in today's predominant academic approach, particularly in Turkey, but also to some extent abroad, the common idea is that the Alevi tradition is not high culture and therefore not a bearer of high values, making it a simpler, quote unquote, field of study. It is thought that if poetic language is easier to understand, it's because the poetry itself is less complicated and philosophical. Yet often, the poem that seems easiest to access opens up layer by layer before us as we examine it, preventing us from exhausting its meaning. Taking poetry as a starting point for examining a belief system is in many ways more difficult than analyzing a treatise. What we need to ask is why a system of faith has been expressed in the form of poetry in the context of Alevism, and what it means for an entire system of belief to be conveyed through poetry. However, as an approach that alienates popular tradition will always confer a secondary position on orality and therefore on poetry, confining Alevism to the category of popular beliefs or, at worst, non-Islamic innovations. By examining the commonalities and differences between the 19th century manuscript version of a Deish and its current interpretation, we will also find a way to think differently about the binaries of contemporary versus historical and urban versus rural Alevism that provoke much discussion in both academia and the Alevi community. We will find a way to portray the history of modern Alevism as much through continuities as through ruptures and discordances, because it is the same. Of course, there's changes, but there's, as I explained, that every performance of a poem has changes. But when we have that perspective, we see that in many cases in contemporary Alevism, the context has changed, the actors have changed. Locations have changed, we're in a trans-cultural networks, etc. And then you have the same poem being sung. So it is sort of a way to write a global history of Alevism that brings pre-modern and modern Alevism side by side. I think one of the ways you could do that is through a history of the Deish itself and through a study of manuscript sources on the Deish. By grasping the link between the representation of a Deish in a Cemevi, the contemporary name for places of worship, in Germany or Austria, where the context has radically changed, and a 19th century manuscript, by studying how the philological content of a poem is reinterpreted in different contexts, we can become Islamologists, literary critics, anthropologists, ethnomusicologists, historians, linguists, and philosophers all at once. This multidisciplinary perspective that can only be achieved through a close scrutiny of manuscript sources is perhaps the most important quality of the rich and unique field of Alevi studies. And I want to end there, but before, so I want to show you the manuscript, that my PhD student, who was at the time my master's student, and I have uncovered, and he did his master's thesis on this, and hopefully it will be a book soon. And I want to show you this manuscript so that we have, we need to see a manuscript. Okay, so you can see it, right? Let's start with let's start at the beginning though. So this is the mecmua of Aşık Penahi that I was telling you about, who was a Bektashi dervish, but who also identified as Halveti and Vahdeti and Melami, and he belonged to the lodge of Şeyh Hamidin Veli Somuncu Baba, who's also a descendant of him. And so this is his this is his notebook. And you can see, when you see Ali, you can see immediately in some of these texts that they were sung, just from the repetitions. The first text that it begins with in the Noktatul Beyan is a hurufi text, and it's very interesting because there are many versions of it, and one of the things that you get with this proliferation of notebook is that you can summarize the way we do in our notebooks. You can summarize a text. You borrow a text. You can borrow a text. So that should tell you something about literacy levels and everything. And you can summarize the text, or you can have excerpts from text. And so it's a way in which different texts can proliferate under the same name as well. And you can see there's more than one there's more tand one handwriting, but most of it belongs to him. So this one, let's see, look at this. Meyli Baba. So this is, and actually it's very interesting because this one is Meyli Baba. I think there was one that was Virani Baba earlier. This one, Nutku Virani Baba. as you can see, that the Irani that we were talking about. But Meli Baba is also interesting because it's his contemporary. So he also has poems by his contemporaries, or what we call aşık atışması, which I don't know how to say in English now. So like back and forth, improvisational back and forth between singer poets. You have them here, which makes you imagine, this aşık himself being in an oral context, in a cafe, probably, in a kahvehane, and in seeing these people improvising together, or in a lodge, most likely, and writing it down in his notebook, and so even seeing who in looking at who in this text is his contemporaries tells us something about his social circle. It actually gives you, looking at a manuscript like this from the perspective of trying to understand the personality and of a compiler who is himself a poet, is very interesting, because at the same time you see what he read and who he was influenced by in his own poetry. He gives it to you, and a lot of what he writes in his notebook is his own material. The moment it becomes part of somebody's notebook, this is something that I should also stress, that is different from our understanding of copyright, is that, why do these pre-modern authors feel like they can, I don't know, redact another person's poem in their own notebook? Because the moment it enters their own space, it's their own poem. It's for themselves. And this is, of course, changes. This is a result of a note, or a book, or a manuscript that belongs to someone, that is their own personal notes, is a result of changes in patterns of literacy that Ali Kara Mustafa was talking about from the 16th century onwards, that is related to the development of print culture in the West. And I just want to show you, I think somewhere towards the end, there should be a colophon. Of course, the way we came up, I found this manuscript, but as I said, my student worked on it. What I've started doing is to just look at try to find manuscripts with miscellanies with colophons. And you can see that unless somebody really takes identifies with the notebook that they created for themselves, with their personal anthology of what matters to them, maybe they will not necessarily write their name down on it, but they might not write their name down on it and still identified with it. But if they write their name and all of their information, and sometimes there's one poem about a liturgical poem praising Hacı Bektaş, for instance. So it's by him, by the compiler. So you get a person's faith, a person's connections, a person's literacy level, everything from a text, a manuscript like this. And what we do actually need is a database of all the miscellanies with colophons that exist from the late 18th to the early 20th century. So this is just reading the colophon. So here he's talking about he's this is where he talks about being Abdü Evladu Postişini dergahı Şeyh Hamidi Veli ve Halife-i Halveti ve Vahdeti ve Muhibbi Nazenin. The Muhibbi Nazenin is very important, actually, being because it's a reference to the Bektashis being undercover and post 1826. This is where I want to end. I hope that it has been useful, and I'm looking forward to questions and comments.